On August 9th, 1898, a small package arrived in Dover, Delaware, addressed to Mrs. John P. Dunning. There was nothing unusual about its appearance. It was not marked urgent. It carried no warning. It resembled the many parcels that moved through the postal system each day, passing from hand to hand without comment. The package was delivered to the Pennington household, where Mary Elizabeth Dunning was living at the time. The address was familiar. The name on the label raised no immediate concern. Packages from acquaintances were not uncommon, and nothing about the delivery suggested that this one required special attention. Inside the parcel was a box of candy, bonbons arranged neatly, presented as a gift rather than a purchase. There was no visible damage to the packaging. No sign of tampering was noted at the time. The contents appeared ordinary, consistent with what might be sent as a gesture of courtesy or affection. The box was opened without hesitation. The candy was shared within the household circle, handled casually, passed from one person to another. There was no effort to preserve the wrapping or examine the contents closely. Nothing about the candy's appearance, taste, or presentation prompted concern in those first moments. At this stage, the sender was not questioned. The parcel was not treated as suspicious, and no attempt was made to determine where it had been mailed from or who had arranged its delivery. It was received as intended, a harmless offering, indistinguishable from countless others exchanged through the mail. The evening continued without interruption. Daily routines resumed. Conversations moved on. The box remained within the home, partially consumed, its remaining contents left where they had been opened. Only later would attention return to the details of that delivery, the handwriting on the label, the absence of a clear sender, the timing, its arrival. At the moment it was received, none of those details carried weight. They were not recorded, preserved, or examined. What mattered then was only that the package had arrived, been opened, and shared. By the end of the evening, that assumption had begun to shift. The ordinary nature of the delivery, its lack of distinction, would later become one of its defining features. A box of candy had entered the household without resistance, without question, and without leaving an immediate trace of danger. What had arrived as a simple gift would not remain one. And before the night had passed, the contents of that box would begin to separate themselves from every other object in the room, no longer as food, but as something that required attention, explanation, and eventually preservation. Tonight we trace the case of Cordelia Botkin, an investigation built not on a crime scene, but on distance, letters, and a box that traveled quietly through the postal system. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, the time where you are right now, and if you find this story worth preserving, like the video and subscribe for more documented cases exactly as the records left them. The change did not come days later. It began the same night the candy was eaten. At first, there was confusion rather than alarm. What appeared was not an immediate crisis, but a sudden and unexplained deterioration in how several members of the household felt. The onset was close enough in time to be noticed, yet distant enough to delay certainty. There was no single moment that marked the shift, only a gradual recognition that something was wrong. As the evening progressed, the symptoms intensified for some while remaining absent or mild in others. This uneven pattern complicated the situation. Those affected did not respond in the same way or at the same pace. What connected them was not the severity of their condition, but a shared detail that had seemed insignificant only hours earlier. All had eaten from the same box of candy. Medical assistance was sought. Physicians were called, and initial assessments focused on treating the immediate condition rather than identifying a cause. At this stage, there was no confirmed explanation. The household could not yet determine whether the illness was coincidental, environmental, or connected to something consumed earlier in the day. Two women, Mary Elizabeth Dunning and her sister Ida Harriet Dean, would later be identified in official summaries as the victims associated with the fatal outcome of the incident. Others who had sampled the candy did not experience the same progression. They recovered. The difference in outcomes would later become a critical part of the case record. During the night, attention returned repeatedly to what had been eaten. The meal itself offered no clear answer. Nothing prepared in the home produced a similar reaction. The only common item shared by those affected was the candy that had arrived earlier that day. The box, still partially full, remained where it had been left. Its contents were no longer ignored. Without being moved or altered, it began to draw scrutiny. What had been accepted casually now carried weight. By morning, the situation had shifted from uncertainty to concern. The illness had not resolved. Instead, it had deepened in ways that could not be explained by ordinary causes. Physicians began to reconsider earlier assumptions. The possibility that the source was not accidental was no longer dismissed. The household's focus narrowed. The candy was no longer treated as a gift. It was isolated. Its remaining pieces were set aside. What had been opened without thought the previous evening was now handled with care, not because its nature was understood, but because its role could no longer be ignored. If the cause of the illness was in the candy, then the next question was no longer medical. It was logistical. Where had it come from, and who could have sent it from so far away? What remained in the box after the illness was no longer treated as food. Once the connection between the shared candy and the sudden illness could no longer be dismissed, attention shifted away from the individuals affected and toward the object they had in common. The box, still containing several uneaten pieces, was set aside. It was not discarded. It was not handled casually. Its remaining contents were preserved, not because their nature was understood, but because their presence demanded explanation. Physicians who had first responded to the illness began reassessing the situation. Initial uncertainty gave way to a narrower line of inquiry. The pattern of symptoms, combined with the shared source, suggested an external agent rather than an internal condition. What had first appeared as an unexplained medical episode now required examination beyond the household. The remaining pieces of candy were retained and examined. Their appearance offered no immediate clues. They showed no visible alteration. Nothing about their surface distinguished them from the pieces that had already been consumed. The danger, if present, was not something that could be seen. As examination continued, medical authorities reached a conclusion that would later appear consistently in official summaries of the case. The candy contained a toxic substance. Subsequent reporting identified this substance as arsenic, named by investigators as the cause of the illnesses that had followed its consumption. This determination altered the status of the incident. What had begun as a domestic emergency now entered a different category. The focus moved beyond treatment and recovery and toward responsibility. The possibility of accidental contamination was considered and dismissed. The substance identified was not something that could have been introduced through ordinary handling or storage within the HE. With that conclusion, the matter passed from physicians to law enforcement. The box of candy was no longer treated as evidence of illness alone. It became evidence of an act. Its arrival, its contents, and its path into the household were now subject to review. The question was no longer what had caused the symptoms, but how the substance had been introduced. Local authorities documented the findings. Information was shared beyond Dover. Newspapers began reporting the incident in different terms, no longer describing it as a misfortune or sudden tragedy, but as a deliberate mailing of a harmful substance sent through the postal system. This change in language reflected a broader shift. The case was no longer confined to one household or one town. The object at its center had traveled. Its journey mattered as much as its contents. If the substance had been added before the package was sealed, then the act had occurred elsewhere. The implications extended beyond Dover's borders. By the time the examination concluded, the box of candy no longer represented the end of the incident. It marked the beginning of an investigation whose origin could not be found inside the house where it had been opened. And if the act had not occurred there, then the next step was to determine where it had begun. The candy was not the first item to arrive by mail. As the examination of the package progressed, investigators began reviewing what had entered the household in the weeks leading up to its arrival. Attention turned to written correspondence that had been received earlier, letters that at the time had drawn little notice and required no response. These letters had not been discarded. They had been kept folded and stored among ordinary household papers. Some were unsigned, others offered no clear return address. None, on their own, had appeared unusual enough to prompt concern when they arrived. Only after the nature of the candy was established did the letters take on significance. Investigators collected the correspondence and reviewed it as a group rather than individually. Read in sequence, the letters suggested continuity. Their phrasing followed a similar pattern. Their tone was consistent. The timing of their arrival placed them within a narrow window leading up to the delivery of the package. The content of the letters was not threatening. They did not contain overt warnings or demands. What drew attention instead was familiarity. The writer appeared to know details about the recipient's life and circumstances that were not widely known and had not been reported publicly. The letters assumed a level of access that suggested prior contact. Handwriting became a point of focus. Authorities noted similarities across the letters, shapes of characters, spacing, and the formation of certain words. While handwriting analysis at the time was limited, the repetition was sufficient to establish that the letters likely came from the same source. No conclusion was drawn regarding authorship. At this stage, the letters were treated as contextual material, not evidence of identity. Their value lay in what they revealed about sequence and intent, not about the person who wrote them. The timing mattered. The letters preceded the arrival of the candy. They did not follow it. This order placed the mailing within a broader pattern of communication rather than as an isolated act. The package, once considered alone, now appeared connected to earlier contact. Investigators compared the letters against known handwriting samples available locally. No match was found among those with routine access to the household. The writing did not correspond to anyone in Dover whose hand could be readily identified. This absence narrowed the field. If the letters did not originate locally, then the sender was elsewhere. The correspondence had traveled before the package did. It had crossed distance without drawing attention. The letters became the first link between the household and a place beyond Delaware. They did not identify their author, but they eliminated one possibility after another. And once Dover could be ruled out, investigators began directing their attention in a single direction, toward the point from which both letters and package could have been sent. They began looking west. The letters stopped being anonymous once investigators compared them to other records. After determining that the correspondence did not originate locally, authorities began expanding the scope of their review. The next step was not to identify a suspect, but to establish whether the handwriting could be connected to anyone already known to the household. This required comparison rather than inference. Investigators gathered writing samples associated with individuals who had corresponded with John Preston Dunning in the period prior to his wife's return to Delaware. These samples were not collected for the purpose of accusation. They were used as reference points, examples against which the letters could be measured. The process was methodical. Handwriting was compared for consistency in letter formation, spacing, and overall structure. At the time, such comparisons relied on visual assessment rather than standardized forensic techniques. Even so, investigators were accustomed to identifying repeated characteristics across documents. Among the samples reviewed, one set drew particular attention. The writing associated with Cordelia Botkin, a married woman residing in San Francisco, showed similarities to the letters that had been sent to the Dunning household. The match was not described as exact. It did not stand on a single feature. Instead, it appeared in the repetition of forms and patterns that, taken together, were difficult to ignore. This connection did not result in immediate action. Botkin's name entered the investigation as a reference, not a charge. She was not accused publicly. No warrant was issued at this stage. Her role in the record was limited to the appearance of her handwriting among those reviewed. Contemporary reporting later noted that handwriting comparison played a significant role in narrowing the field of inquiry. However, within the investigation, investigation itself, the comparison served a more limited purpose. It provided a point of focus where none had previously existed. The connection between Botkin and the Dunning family was not yet explained. The investigation did not pause to establish why correspondence may have existed or what its nature had been. Those questions were not part of this stage. What mattered was location. Botkin was confirmed to be living in San Francisco during the period in question. This detail aligned with the earlier conclusion that the letters did not originate in Delaware. The handwriting did not belong to anyone nearby. It corresponded to someone known to have been elsewhere. The name was added to the file. From that moment forward, the investigation gained direction. Not certainty, but focus. The inquiry had moved from objects to documents, and now from documents to a specific individual. Once a name entered the record, the next step was no longer interpretive. It was practical. Investigators needed to determine whether the package could have been sent from the place where she lived. The investigation crossed the country without anyone leaving their desk. With the focus no longer confined to Dover, authorities turned to the path the package itself had taken. The task was not to identify a sender by assumption, but to reconstruct movement, where the candy had been purchased, how it had been mailed, and from which city it had entered the postal system. Investigators began with the packaging. The box and its wrapping were examined for indicators of origin. Postal markings, labeling practices, and delivery timing were compared against standard routes. From these details, a general direction emerged. The candy had not been purchased locally. Retail inquiries followed. Investigators contacted confectioners whose products matched the description of the bonbons. This process relied on elimination rather than certainty. Shops in Delaware were ruled out first, followed by others along the likely mailing routes. The inquiry eventually narrowed to retailers operating in San Francisco. Postal records supported the same conclusion. The delivery timeline matched mail originating from the West Coast, not from nearby states. Transit duration, sorting intervals, and postmark characteristics all aligned with a package mailed from California. By this point, San Francisco was no longer one of several possibilities. It became the only location that fit every logistical requirement. The investigation did not move ahead of the record. Authorities did not assume who had purchased the candy or under what circumstances. The focus remained on origin and timing, where the item entered the mail stream, and when. Those details aligned with information already established. Cordelia Botkin was confirmed to have been living in San Francisco during the period in which the candy would have been purchased and mailed. This fact did not establish responsibility, it established feasibility. Why? The mailing could have occurred from the city where she resided. The convergence of timelines mattered. The letters had originated from outside Delaware. The handwriting linked them to an individual in San Francisco. The candy's path now pointed to the same city. Each element examined separately had raised questions. Together, they formed a consistent geographic frame. Newspapers began describing the case in broader terms. Reports emphasized its unusual structure, actions taken in one state, followed by consequences in another. The story expanded beyond the details of the household in Dover and into the mechanics of interstate movement. San Francisco became the central setting of the investigation, not because a conclusion had been reached, but because the physical evidence led there. By the end of the tracing process, authorities were no longer attempting to determine who had sent the package. They were determining where the act itself had occurred. And with that shift, the focus of the case moved from investigation to jurisdiction toward the question of where the law could act. The person under suspicion had never been to the place where the deaths occurred. Once the investigation centered on San Francisco, authorities moved from reconstruction to action. The focus was no longer on tracing movement or identifying connections, but on securing custody. The decision was procedural, not interpretive. Evidence had placed the mailing of the package in California. That fact alone was sufficient to proceed. Cordelia Botkin was located and taken into custody in San Francisco. The arrest did not follow a public announcement or extended search. It occurred as the result of accumulated findings, the correspondence, the handwriting comparison, and the logistical tracing of the package through the postal system. What made the arrest unusual was not the manner in which it was carried out, but the absence of a local event to accompany it. There was no scene in California tied directly to harm. No illness had been reported there. No deaths had occurred within the state's borders. The act under examination was one of preparation and dispatch, not of immediate outcome. Contemporary newspaper accounts emphasized this distinction. Reports described the case as one in which the consequences had unfolded elsewhere, while the alleged initiating act remained rooted in California. The distance between those 2 points became central to how the arrest was understood. Botkin was informed of the reason for her detention. She denied responsibility, as noted in period coverage. The denial was recorded without elaboration or response. At this stage, no testimony was taken and no explanation was offered. The investigation did not require a statement. It required custody. The arrest marked a transition in the case. Until this point, the inquiry had existed across documents, objects, and timelines. With Botkin detained, the matter entered a formal legal phase. Responsibility for its direction shifted from investigators to the court. There was no immediate resolution. The evidence that had led to the arrest remained circumstantial in nature, assembled from correspondence and movement rather than direct observation. The absence of a local incident complicated how the case would proceed. That complication was not ignored. From the moment of her arrest, the question surrounding the case was no longer limited to identity. The issue was no longer who had sent the package. It was whether the act of sending it, carried out in one state, could be addressed by a court when its effects had been realized in another. With the arrest completed, the investigation gave way to a different process. The case entered the court system not with certainty, but with a problem that had yet to be resolved. The question before the law was no longer who. It was where the crime legally existed. Before evidence could be weighed, the court had to decide whether it belonged there at all. With Cordelia Botkin in custody, the case moved into a courtroom in California, but not without resistance. The earliest proceedings were defined less by facts than by boundaries. The central issue was not what had happened, but where it could be judged. The defense challenged the court's authority from the outset. Their position was direct. The deaths connected to the case had occurred in Delaware, not California. No one had fallen ill within the state. No fatal outcome had taken place inside its borders. On that basis, they argued, California lacked jurisdiction to try the matter. The prosecution presented a different framework. They did not dispute where the deaths occurred. Instead, they focused on where the initiating act had taken place. The mailing of the package, they argued, was the critical moment. That act, preparation and dispatch, had occurred in California. From their position, the location of the outcome did not negate the location of the action that set events in motion. These arguments were not abstract. They were grounded in how the law defined responsibility when actions and consequences were separated by distance. The court was required to consider whether a case could be tried where the act began, even if its effects were realized elsewhere. Newspapers followed the proceedings closely. Coverage emphasized the unusual structure of the case rather than the details of the evidence. Reports described it as a rare instance of a crime whose consequences crossed state lines, raising questions that extended beyond the individuals involved. Public attention grew not because new information was introduced, but because of uncertainty. The outcome of the jurisdiction challenge would determine whether the trial could continue at all. Until that question was resolved, every other issue remained secondary. The court heard arguments on both sides. Legal precedents were cited, statutes were referenced. The discussion remained focused on authority rather than guilt. At this stage, no testimony was taken, no evidence was weighed. The case paused at the threshold. Ultimately, the court allowed proceedings to move forward. The decision did not resolve the underlying dispute. Jurisdiction challenges remained active and unresolved. But for the moment, the trial was permitted to continue under California's authority, even as questions about that authority persisted. This allowance carried its own instability. The case advanced without a settled foundation. The evidence would be presented under a framework that might later be reconsidered. Every step taken was subject to review. The trial would proceed, but it would do so under conditions that made its outcome uncertain from the beginning, resting not only on what could be proven, but on whether the court itself would ultimately be deemed the proper place to hear it. The jury reached a decision, but the case did not settle. After weeks of proceedings, the first trial moved toward its conclusion. The court shifted from argument to assessment. The jury was asked to consider the materials that had been assembled, the letters received in Dover, the handwriting comparisons, the tracing of the candy's purchase and mailing, and the reconstructed timeline linking those elements together. No single piece of evidence stood alone. The case was built on accumulation rather than observation. The jury weighed how the correspondence preceded the package, how the package's origin aligned with the location established through postal and retail records, and how these elements converged in California rather than Delaware. In 1898, the jury returned a guilty verdict against Cordelia Botkin. The decision was delivered without elaboration. It reflected acceptance of the prosecution's framework, that the act initiating the chain of events had occurred in California, and that responsibility could be assigned there despite the distance between action and outcome. Following the verdict, the court imposed a sentence of life imprisonment. Contemporary reporting noted the unusual nature of the outcome. Convictions of this kind were rare, not because of the charge itself, but because of the geography involved. The act under scrutiny had been carried out in one state, while the fatal consequences had unfolded in another. The verdict affirmed that separation did not prevent judgment. The case appeared, on paper, to have reached its end. But the legal questions raised earlier had not been resolved by the verdict. They had only been postponed. Almost immediately, challenges to the conviction continued. These challenges did not focus on the evidence presented to the jury. The letters, the mailing records, and the timeline were not the point of dispute. Instead, the arguments returned to the issue that had shadowed the case from the beginning: jurisdiction. Defense filings questioned whether California courts had the authority to impose a sentence for deaths that occurred outside the state's borders. The argument was not new, but its significance had increased now that a verdict had been reached. What had been theoretical during the trial became consequential after sentencing. The conviction remained in place. The sentence was enforced. Botkin was held in custody. At the same time, the legal foundation supporting the verdict remained under review. The case entered a period of uncertainty. On the surface, the matter appeared resolved. A verdict had been delivered. A sentence had been imposed. Yet the structure supporting those outcomes had not been settled. The law had delivered a decision, but it had not finished speaking. The sentence stood, even as the question of whether it could stand at all moved quietly into the next phase of the case. The conviction did not collapse because of new facts, but because of old ones. After the verdict and sentence were imposed, the case entered appellate review. This stage did not revisit the events in Dover or the material evidence presented at trial. The letters, the mailing records, and the reconstructed timeline were not disputed. Instead, the appeal focused on questions that had existed before the jury was ever seated. At issue was procedure. Defense arguments returned to the problem of jurisdiction, now sharpened by the consequences of conviction. The appeal examined whether the trial court had properly exercised authority in a case where the fatal outcomes occurred beyond California's borders. The question was no longer theoretical. It carried the weight of a life sentence. The reviewing court considered the structure of the prosecution's case. It did not evaluate whether the evidence was persuasive. It examined whether the process by which the verdict had been reached met legal requirements, specifically whether California law permitted a conviction under the circumstances presented. The conclusion did not favor finality. The original conviction was overturned on appeal, not because the evidence was found lacking, but because the legal framework supporting the trial was deemed insufficient. The issue was procedural. The court determined that unresolved questions about jurisdiction and the manner in which the case had been tried could not be set aside. This decision did not clear Botkin's name. It did not declare the evidence unreliable. Contemporary reporting was careful on this point. Newspapers described the reversal as a setback for prosecutors, not an exoneration. The case was not dismissed. It was returned to the system. During this period, Cordelia Botkin remained in custody. The overturning of the conviction did not result in her release. Instead, it set the responsibility back on the state to determine whether and how the case could proceed again. The reversal altered the posture of the case. What had appeared resolved was reopened. The certainty of the verdict gave way to renewed scrutiny. The legal questions that had been deferred during the first trial now demanded answers before any further judgment could be imposed. For prosecutors, the task was not to introduce new material, but to address the deficiencies identified by the appellate court. The same evidence would need to be presented under a structure that could withstand review. The case returned to court changed, but not transformed. The facts remained the same. The record remained intact. What differed was the standard to which the proceedings would now be held. The matter was no longer whether a jury could be persuaded. It was whether the case could be tried at all under the law. The appeal closed one chapter of the case without resolving it. And with that decision, the proceedings began again, carrying the same evidence but under stricter scrutiny. When the case returned to court, nothing about it was new, except the rules. By 1904, the proceedings resumed under a framework shaped by the earlier reversal. The purpose of the retrial was not to reinterpret the events in Dover or reconsider the material already examined. It was to correct the procedural weaknesses that had undermined the first conviction. The state did not present a revised account of what had occurred. The prosecution relied on the same categories of evidence that had formed the basis of the original case: the correspondence received by the Dunning household, the tracing of the mailed package, and the reconstructed timeline connecting those elements to California. These materials were referenced, not replayed. Their substance was already known. What differed was the legal foundation supporting their presentation. Before testimony proceeded, the court addressed the jurisdiction issue that had previously destabilized the case. Under California law, as clarified during the appellate review, the court affirmed its authority to try offenses in which the initiating act occurred within the state, even if the resulting harm was realized elsewhere. This determination settled the question that had lingered since Botkin's arrest. With jurisdiction formally established, the retrial advanced without interruption. The proceedings moved forward without the uncertainty that had accompanied the first trial. Arguments were presented within the clarified legal structure. The evidence was admitted under rules now deemed sufficient to sustain a verdict. No new witnesses altered the scope of the case. No additional materials expanded the record. The retrial did not seek novelty, it sought resolution. At the conclusion of the proceedings, the jury returned a second guilty verdict against Cordelia Botkin. The decision reaffirmed the state's position under the corrected framework. This time, the verdict rested on a foundation that had been reviewed and upheld. The outcome carried a different weight than the first. There was no immediate challenge to the court's authority. The procedural objections that had once threatened the case had been addressed before the verdict was reached. The ruling did not reopen questions about where the crime could be tried. With the verdict restored, the case reached a point of finality within the courtroom. There were no further trials to anticipate. The matter did not return to argument. The legal uncertainty that had defined the earlier proceedings was resolved not through reinterpretation of facts, but through clarification of law. The case, which had moved between states and courts for years, now came to rest. With the second verdict secured, the judicial phase of the story concluded. The file closed, not with new revelations, but with the confirmation that the law would stand where it had once wavered. With the verdict restored, the case left the courtroom permanently. After the second verdict, Cordelia Botkin disappeared from public view. With the retrial concluded, the case moved out of the courtroom and into the administrative routines of incarceration. Botkin was committed to San Quentin State Prison, where her name entered institutional records rather than headlines. The transfer marked the end of public proceedings and the beginning of a period defined by confinement rather than controversy. Press coverage diminished quickly. The legal questions that had once drawn national attention had been resolved. Without new filings or hearings, the case no longer generated sustained reporting. What remained was a sentence to be carried out quietly, away from the scrutiny that had followed the earlier stages of the investigation. Prison records from this period note a decline in Botkin's mental condition during her incarceration. These observations appear in institutional language recorded without elaboration or interpretation. They do not describe incidents or causes. They document change over time, noted by those responsible for maintaining the prison's files. There were no further appeals that altered her status. The conviction stood. The sentence was enforced. The case, which had once moved across state lines and courts, narrowed to a single location and a fixed routine. Years passed without public developments. On March 7, 1910, Cordelia Botkin died while still in custody at San Quentin. The date was entered into prison records without accompanying statement or explanation beyond the required notation. There was no public announcement beyond brief notices. The cause of death was recorded by the institution as softening of the brain associated with melancholia, a term used in official documentation of the period. The entry reflected the medical language of the time rather than a detailed account of condition or progression. No addit. Final commentary accompanied the record. With that notation, the administrative file reached its end. There was no posthumous review of the case. No new evidence emerged. The records did not return to the events in Dover or to the questions that had once unsettled the courts. The final documentation concerned only the fact of death and the place where it occurred. The story concluded not with resolution, but with closure by record. The case that had begun with a package crossing the country ended with a line in a ledger kept by the state. No interpretation followed, no summary was offered. The documentation did not explain what could not be explained earlier. The record ends without commentary, and with that final entry, the case closes without explanation.